The day my father laughed at me in front of his entire legal team, I made a decision I never told anyone about. He was sitting at the head of the conference table in his charcoal Armani suit, gold cufflinks catching the light, looking at me the way you'd look at something stuck to the bottom of your shoe. His attorney, a man named Mr. Doane Aldridge, silver-haired and expensive, had just slid a folder across the table toward me. My father leaned back in his chair and said, "She won't understand half of it. Just show her where to sign." I was 28 years old. I had a master's degree in urban planning from Georgetown, and my father had just written me off like a line item in a budget he wanted to cut. I picked up the folder, and I read every page. Let me back up. My name is Layla Mercer, and for most of my life I believed the story my father told about me, that I was the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who always made things harder than they needed to be. My father built Mercer Development Group from nothing. Commercial real estate, mostly in the Mid-Atlantic region, shopping centers, mixed-use developments, a few high-end office parks in Northern Virginia. By the time I was in middle school, his name was on buildings. By the time I graduated high school, he had a profile in the Washington Business Journal. He was the kind of man who shook hands with senators and remembered their kids' names. My mother left when I was 7. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it explains why I spent the next 20 years trying so hard to make him proud of me. She left, and I stayed, and I thought that meant something. It didn't. After she was gone, it was just the two of us for a while. Then, when I was 10, he married a woman I'll call my stepmother. Polished, well-dressed, with a son from her first marriage who was 3 years older than me. I'll call him my stepbrother. He was the kind of kid who knew exactly how to make adults laugh, exactly how to make himself likable, and exactly how to make sure every good thing in the room pointed toward him. I tried to like him. I genuinely did, but there's a particular kind of cruelty that comes dressed in a smile, and he was fluent in it. By the time I was in high school, the architecture of our family had been quietly reorganized. My father's attention, his time, his pride, all of it had been redirected. My stepbrother joined the company right out of college, without interviewing, without a resume, without anything except proximity and charm. I went to graduate school and wrote a thesis on adaptive reuse of commercial properties and came back with actual ideas, actual skills, actual ambition for the company my father had built. That's when I found out the offer wasn't open to me. "You'd be stepping on toes," my father said. We were at dinner. He said it casually, cutting his steak, not quite meeting my eyes. "The team is already set. You'd be better off somewhere else first. Get some experience." I had more experience than my stepbrother had in his entire body. But that's not what this was about. I understood that even then, so I did something else. I took a job with a development firm in Richmond, a smaller company, but one that actually let me work. I spent 4 years there. I led 2 projects. I built relationships with contractors, with city planning boards, with private equity contacts I still have to this day. And the whole time, quietly, on evenings and weekends, I was doing something else. I was building something of my own. It started with a single distressed commercial property in Alexandria, a former strip mall, half vacant, the kind of thing nobody wanted to touch. I used every dollar I'd saved. I spent 3 months getting the zoning variance approved. I worked with a contractor I'll call my contractor, a man named Ray who had 20 years of experience and absolutely zero patience for nonsense. And together, we turned that property into something genuinely worth looking at. I sold it 14 months later for twice what I paid. I did it again. And again. I kept it quiet. I didn't talk about it on social media. I didn't tell my father. I kept my last name off the LLC. The company I built was called Cedarwood Capital Partners, and by the time my father summoned me to that conference room in Tyson's Corner with Mr. Conference Room, Aldridge in the folder and the comment about signing without understanding, Cedarwood had quietly acquired 3 properties in markets where Mercer Development was about to expand. He didn't know that yet. What he wanted me to sign was a release of interest. a document that would relinquish any claim I might have to the family business. He framed it as a formality. He said the company was reorganizing, bringing in outside investors, and the structure required clean lines of ownership. He said it would be better for everyone. What the document actually said, buried in the third addendum, was that I was releasing not only my equity interest in Mercer Development, but also any future claim to intellectual property, client relationships, or business strategies I had contributed to the company during the 18 months I had worked there before he told me to leave. I had spent those 18 months doing informal consulting work, unpaid, because he asked me to. Because I still believed at that point that I could earn my way in. I put the folder down. I said, I need to review this with my own attorney. My father looked at my stepmother. She pressed her lips together. My stepbrother, who was sitting in the corner on his phone, looked up for the first time. My father said, There's really nothing to review. It's standard language. Mr. Aldridge drafted it himself. I said, Then it'll still be standard language next week. I picked up my bag and I walked out. What happened next took 2 years. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't fast, and there were months in the middle where I wondered if I was wrong about everything. I hired an attorney named Ms. Park. She was 43, matter of fact, not warm in the way people sometimes want their attorneys to be warm, which is exactly why I chose her. She looked at the document my father had asked me to sign and set it down and said, They would have taken your name off everything you built for them. I said I knew. She said, Do you want to fight or do you want to win? I said I wanted to win. Here's what most people don't understand about the kind of fight I was in. It's not loud. It doesn't happen in shouting matches at the dinner table. It happens in documents, in financing structures, in the quiet accumulation of leverage. My father understood power in a very direct way. He had the name, the network, the money. What he didn't understand was that I had spent 4 years building something he had no visibility into, and that something was now positioned in exactly the right places. Mercer Development was expanding into 2 new markets, Roanoke and Fredericksburg. My father had spent the better part of a year lining up a commercial anchor tenant for the Fredericksburg project. The whole deal depended on a specific parcel of land adjacent to the site, a parcel that, 8 months earlier, Cedarwood Capital Partners had acquired quietly through a third-party intermediary for a price nobody questioned at the time. That parcel was mine. My stepbrother figured it out first, actually. He called me one evening. It was a Tuesday in November, I remember, because there was ice on the roads, and his voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not the easy, practiced warmth he used when he wanted something. Something tighter, something closer to scared. He said, Did you know about the Fredericksburg deal when you bought that land? I said, I do a lot of research before I buy land. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dad is going to be furious. I said, He should have read my resume. My father called 3 days later. He didn't start with pleasantries. He said, You're going to sell us that parcel. I said, I'm open to discussing it. He said, Don't play games with me. I said, I'm not playing anything. I own a piece of land. You need it. That's a transaction. If you want to have a transaction, have your attorney call Ms. Park. He said, You did this on purpose. I said, I built a company and I acquired properties in growing markets. If that overlaps with your plans, that's an interesting coincidence. He hung up. What followed was 6 weeks of negotiations I was not personally in the room for, which was intentional. Ms. Park represented me. I read every email, reviewed every counter, made every decision, and let her be the one who delivered them. My father kept asking to speak to me directly. Ms. Nuth. Park kept explaining that all communications should go through her. I think that was the part that bothered him most. Not the money. The fact that I had learned to do what he'd always done. Keep the process at arm's length. Keep the decision-making power with yourself. Let the attorneys absorb the friction. He had taught me that, actually. I had watched him do it my whole childhood. In the end, the deal we reached was not just about the land. Cedarwood had something Mercer Development needed. Not just the parcel, but the zoning relationships I had spent years building with the city of Fredericksburg, the contractor network that could actually deliver the project on time, and a co-development structure that, frankly, made the whole thing financially stronger than what my father had been planning alone. Mr. Aldridge called Ms. Park and said his client was open to a partnership structure. Miss Park called me and said, "They want a seat at your table." I said, "Tell them it's not my table anymore. Tell them it's a boardroom, and they can apply for a seat like everyone else." The meeting where everything finally came together was in a conference room in downtown Fredericksburg, in a building that Cedarwood had already contracted to renovate. I had chosen the location on purpose. I wanted my father to walk into a room I had built before we started talking. He arrived with Mr. Aldridge and my stepbrother. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which was almost 18 months. He looked like a man who had recently realized that something he thought he owned had been owned by someone else the whole time. I was already seated when they came in. I had a glass of water in front of me and a legal pad I didn't need. Across from me was the lead partner from the private equity group that Cedarwood had been working with, a firm based in McLean, Virginia that had been following our portfolio for 2 years. My father sat down. He looked at me. He looked at the equity partner. He looked back at me. He said, "You put this together." I said, "We put it together." Mr. Aldridge leaned over and said something quietly to my father. My father's jaw tightened. My stepbrother was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not quite guilt. Not quite admiration. Something that sat between them, complicated and unresolved. We negotiated for 3 hours. I let Miss Park do most of the talking. I spoke when I needed to, clearly and briefly, and I watched my father recalibrate every time I did. Watched him adjust his understanding of what he was dealing with. Watched the version of me he'd carried in his head for 30 years, slowly not fit the person sitting across from him. When we broke for a recess, my stepbrother followed me into the hallway. He said, "I didn't know about the document, the one they asked you to sign." I looked at him. He said, I knew the company was reorganizing. I didn't know the IP clause was in there." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm sorry, I think I took up a lot of space that wasn't mine to take." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about all the dinners and the holidays and the conversations where I had tried to belong to a family that had already decided I was peripheral. I thought about the 12 years I spent making myself smaller so he could be bigger. I said, "Thank you for saying that." I meant it. I didn't give him more than that, but I meant what I gave him. The deal closed on a Thursday in February. Cedarwood entered into a co-development partnership with Mercer Development for the Fredericksburg project, with a revenue share structure that reflected the actual value each party was bringing, which meant the split was not equal, and everyone in that room understood why. I did not take my father's name off his company. I didn't want it. I didn't want his company, or his approval, or the childhood I'd spent trying to earn either of those things. What I wanted was what I had built, and I had that. A few weeks after the closing, my father called me. Not through attorneys this time. He called my personal number on a Sunday morning. He said, "I've been thinking about what I should have done differently." I said, "Okay." He said, "I think I let other people's priorities become mine in a way that wasn't fair to you." It was the closest thing to an apology he'd ever given me, and it was still careful, still managed, still framed in a way that kept a slight distance. But I had stopped needing him to say it perfectly. I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "Are you well?" I said, "I'm really well." And I was. I am really well. And I was. I am. People ask me sometimes, people who hear pieces of this story, whether I did it to hurt him, whether the whole thing was about revenge. I think about how to answer that honestly. I didn't build Cedarwood to punish my father. I built it because I had something to prove to myself, and the only proof I would accept was real. Not a title on a business card someone handed me out of obligation. Not a seat at a table I was allowed into by grace. Something I earned in the only language that doesn't lie: numbers, closings, signatures on documents I drafted myself. The fact that what I built happened to intersect with what he was building. That was the market doing what the market does. I picked good locations. Good locations are good for everyone who wants to develop in the Mid-Atlantic region. That includes my father. But I also won't pretend that when I sat across that table in Fredericksburg and watched him understand finally, fully, without any more room for the old story, I won't pretend there was nothing satisfying about that. There was. There was something that had been tight in my chest for a very long time, and it loosened. Not because I'd beaten him, because I'd stopped needing to. The difference matters. I spent a lot of years confusing those two things. My stepbrother and I don't talk often, but we talk. Last spring, he texted me a picture of the Fredericksburg project under construction. The steel going up on the second phase, a blue sky behind it, cranes against the horizon. He wrote, "You should see this. It's actually beautiful." I wrote back, "I know. I designed that corner." He sent a laughing emoji. I sent one back. "My father and I have dinner once a quarter now. It's not warm in the way I used to want it to be, in the way a daughter in a movie would want it to be. But it's honest. He asks real questions. I give real answers. We talk about the market, about the projects, about what's coming in the next cycle." Once, toward the end of a dinner last fall, he said, "You didn't have to keep my name off your LLC." I said, "I know." He said, "Why did you?" I thought about it. Then I said, "Because when I walked into that room in Fredericksburg, I wanted you to see someone you didn't recognize. And then I wanted you to realize you should have." He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. Just once. That was enough. I kept the ring from that old identity, the one that belonged to the version of me that was still waiting to be chosen. I don't wear it. I keep it in a small dish on my dresser next to my keys. Some mornings when I'm leaving for work, I look at it, not with sadness, with something more like gratitude for the woman who was stubborn enough to not sign that paper, to walk out of that conference room, to drive home in the dark and start building something no one could take her name off of. She didn't know, when she was doing all of that, how it would end. She just knew she wasn't going to let someone else write the ending. I used to think that what I wanted was for my father to apologize, a real one. Not the careful, managed kind he eventually gave me, but something raw and direct and unguarded. I spent a long time waiting for that. I don't think I even realized how much energy I was putting into that waiting until I stopped. Here's what I actually learned from all of it. And I mean learned the way you learn things that cost you something. Not the kind of lesson you read in a book and nod at, but the kind that rewires how you see everything afterward. What you build in silence is the only thing nobody can dispute. My father had a story about me, his wife had a story about me, my stepbrother had a story about me, and for years I kept trying to correct that story through argument, through presence, through making myself useful enough that they'd have to revise it. None of that worked. What worked was building something real in a place they couldn't see, and then letting reality speak for itself when the moment came. When Mr. Aldridge sat across that table in Fredericksburg and had to acknowledge what cedarwood actually was, there was nothing to argue with. Numbers don't have feelings. Ownership documents don't have feelings. The market doesn't care what story your family told about you. That's the thing about integrity. And I mean integrity in the structural sense, the way a building either holds its own weight or doesn't. You can't fake it over time. My father's company was built on real work, and I respect that. But what cracked it was the assumption that proximity to power could substitute for actual competence. My stepbrother got a seat at the table because he was charming and present. I built my own table because I had no other option. And in the end, the table I built was the one that mattered. I think about Miss Park sometimes, the way she asked me that first day whether I wanted to fight or whether I wanted to win. At the time, I thought those were almost the same thing. I understand now that they're almost opposites. Fighting is reactive. It keeps you tethered to whoever hurt you, spinning in their orbit, measuring your moves against theirs. Winning. Real winning means you stopped looking at them and started looking at what you were actually trying to build. The moment I stopped trying to prove something to my father and started just doing the work, Everything got cleaner, clearer, faster. I don't carry bitterness about how it all went. Not because I forced myself to let it go, but because I genuinely ran out of room for it. When your days are full of real things, deals that close, projects that rise out of the ground, relationships built on actual trust, there's no space left for old grievances. They just become part of the story. The part that explains why you work the way you work, why you read every page of every document, why you never sign something you don't fully understand. Layla Mercer didn't walk out of that conference room in Tyson's corner because she was brave. She walked out because something in her already knew the story wasn't over, and she was the only one who could finish it right.